Moscow expected hunger to do what armies could not. It expected fear to break Western resolve. But Berlin became the moment America showed it could win without firing a shot. This is a story about a siege without soldiers, about a blockade meant to strangle a city into submission, about how the Soviet Union tried to use geography as a weapon, and how the United States answered with something unexpected. Not tanks or troops, but aircraft. Not combat, but logistics. Not war, but one of the largest peacetime air supply efforts of its era. The year was 1948. The recovery of Western Europe was beginning to take hold. The programs designed to rebuild shattered economies were starting to show results, and this progress alarmed Moscow. The Soviets needed a new test. They found it in a city that sat like an island in the middle of territory they controlled. Picture a family in West Berlin in the early days of the blockade. A mother rationing the coal that remained from before the roads closed. Children who did not fully understand why the shops were empty. A father listening to the news, trying to understand what would happen next. And above them, the sound of aircraft engines. At first just a few, then more, then a constant presence, day and night, the sound of hope arriving through the sky. This was what the blockade meant at the human level. Not abstract politics, but families wondering if there would be food next week. Not grand strategy, but ordinary people caught in the grip of forces they could not control. The residents of West Berlin had already survived the war, the bombing, the occupation. Now they faced a new kind of siege, one that came not with artillery but with closed gates and empty roads. Berlin was not just a city. It was a symbol of Western presence in territory the Soviets controlled. A symbol of the refusal to abandon populations to communist rule. A symbol of everything the Cold War was becoming. The eyes of the world were watching. Every government wondering what the West would do was drawing conclusions about what that decision would mean for their own security. When the Soviets closed the roads and rails that connected West Berlin to the outside world, they were betting that the West would have no choice but to retreat. They were betting that the practical difficulties of sustaining 2 million people without ground access would prove insurmountable. They were betting that hunger and cold would accomplish what Soviet divisions could not do without triggering a war. They lost that bet. Historical records and first-hand accounts from participants on all sides have revealed how close the situation came to catastrophe, and how the response that saved Berlin was assembled from determination, improvisation, and the distinctive American capacity to solve logistics problems at scale. This is the story of how that response was organized, of how pilots flew around the clock in weather that grounded sensible men, of how ground crews maintained aircraft that should have been retired, of how a city survived on what could be carried through the air. In the Cold War, sometimes the decisive weapon was not a tank. It was a supply route. To understand why Berlin mattered so much, you have to understand its peculiar position on the map of post-war Europe. The city sat deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of Germany, surrounded on all sides by territory under Soviet control. Yet Berlin itself was divided among the 4 occupying powers, with the Americans, British, and French each administering sectors in the western part of the city. This arrangement had made sense in 1945, when the wartime Allies were still cooperating on the administration of defeated Germany. Berlin had been the Nazi capital. It was symbolically important that all the major Allies share in its occupation. The assumption was that the 4 powers would work together to govern Germany as a whole, and that the arrangements made for Berlin would be temporary measures during the transition to a new German state. But by 1948, that assumption had collapsed. The cooperation that had characterized the final phase of the war had given way to the confrontation that would define the Cold War. The Soviet zone of Germany was being organized along communist lines. The Western zones were moving toward integration with the emerging Western Bloc. The idea of a unified German government that all 4 powers could accept had become fantasy. The wartime agreements that had divided Germany and Berlin had not anticipated this outcome. They had assumed continued cooperation, not confrontation. They had established zones of occupation, not permanent boundaries. The arrangements that had seemed reasonable when allies were working together became dangerous when those allies became adversaries. Berlin's position became untenable. The western sectors of the city were islands of non-communist territory in a communist sea. The population of West Berlin depended entirely on supplies that came from the west, but all the ground routes passed through Soviet-controlled territory. Roads, railways, canals, all of them crossed the Soviet zone before reaching the city. This geographical reality gave the Soviet Union enormous leverage. The Soviets controlled the access. They could permit passage or deny it. They could make the supply of West Berlin easy or impossible. The 2 million people living in the western sectors were, in a very real sense, hostages to Soviet goodwill. The vulnerability was acute when you considered what the city actually needed to survive. West Berlin was not a rural area that could feed itself. It was an urban center dependent on supplies from outside. Food had to be brought in. Medicine had to be brought in. Industrial materials had to be brought in. And above all, fuel had to be brought in. Coal was the critical resource. Berlin's winters were harsh, and coal was what heated homes, powered factories, and generated electricity. Coal was also heavy. Moving enough coal to sustain a city of 2 million people required enormous transportation capacity. This was manageable when railroads and trucks could carry the load. It seemed impossible when only aircraft were available. It seemed impossible when only aircraft were available. The mathematics of coal illustrated the scale of the challenge. Each ton of coal could heat only so many homes for only so many days. A harsh winter consumed coal faster than a mild one. Aircraft could carry only so much weight per flight. The number of flights possible per day was limited by airfield capacity, aircraft availability, and crew endurance. When planners ran the numbers, the gap between what was needed and what seemed achievable was enormous. The Soviet calculation was straightforward. The tonnage required to sustain West Berlin exceeded anything that could realistically be delivered by air. The West would face a choice between abandoning the city and attempting an operation that would inevitably fail. Either outcome would suit Moscow's purposes. And by the spring of 1948, Soviet goodwill had run out. If you control the access, you control the destiny. The tensions that led to the blockade had been building for months. The Western powers were moving toward the creation of a unified West German state that would be integrated into the Western economic and political system. This prospect alarmed Moscow. A strong, Western-oriented Germany was exactly what the Soviet Union had fought the war to prevent. The memories of German invasion were too fresh, the casualties too enormous, for Soviet leaders to accept a revived Germany aligned against them with equanimity. The introduction of currency reform in the Western zones was the immediate trigger. The Western powers introduced a new German mark to replace the worthless Reichsmark that had been the currency since the Nazi period. This currency reform was essential to economic recovery. Without stable money, normal economic activity was impossible. But the reform also represented a step toward the permanent division of Germany into Eastern and Western states. The Soviets protested the currency reform and announced restrictions on traffic to Berlin. What began as harassment escalated into a full blockade. On June 24, 1948, all ground routes to West Berlin were closed. Rail traffic stopped. Road traffic was turned back. Canal barges were not permitted to pass. The city was cut off. The closure was methodical and complete. Soviet forces established checkpoints on every road. Rail lines were blocked by claims of technical problems that somehow never got fixed. The canals that had carried coal and food were declared closed for maintenance. Every route that might have brought supplies to West Berlin was shut down by one justification or another. The Soviet decision to impose the blockade reflected a particular calculation about Western resolve and Western capabilities. Moscow believed that the practical difficulties of sustaining West Berlin without ground access would prove insurmountable. The city consumed enormous quantities of food, fuel, and other supplies every day. Replacing all of this by air seemed impossible. The logistics simply did not seem to work. The calculation made sense on paper. The available aircraft and airfields could theoretically move some cargo, but nothing close to what a city of 2 million required. The Soviets had studied the numbers. They understood the limitations of air transport. They were confident that the mathematics favored them. Soviet planners had experience with air supply from the war. They knew how much effort it took to sustain even a modest force by air. Supplying a city of 2 million would require many times more capacity than any previous airlift had achieved. The Western powers simply did not have enough aircraft, enough airfields, enough crews. Or so Moscow believed. The Soviet leadership also believed that the Western powers would not risk war over Berlin. The stakes were high, but not high enough to justify the catastrophic conflict that would result from a military confrontation. If the ground routes were blocked, and if the air alternative proved inadequate, the West would have no choice but to negotiate from a position of weakness. The terms of any settlement would favor Moscow. This was not war. This was pressure. This was using geography and the threat of starvation to achieve what military force could not achieve without triggering a devastating response. The blockade was designed to be just ambiguous enough that it could be portrayed as something other than an act of aggression. Soviet officials justified the restrictions as technical measures necessitated by the currency reform. They claimed that the new Western currency threatened the economy of the Soviet zone. They presented the blockade as a defensive response to Western provocation rather than as an offensive move to force the West out of Berlin. This narrative was not believed in the West. The pretexts were transparent. The timing was too convenient. The escalation from harassment to full blockade was too deliberate. Western leaders understood exactly what was happening. The Soviet Union was testing whether the commitment to Berlin was real or rhetorical. Moscow bet that hunger and fear would be cheaper than war. The news of the blockade created immediate crisis in Western capitals. The situation seemed to present only bad options. Every path forward carried enormous risks. One option was to accept the blockade and negotiate, but negotiating under duress would signal that Soviet pressure worked. It would encourage similar tactics in the future. It would undermine the credibility of every Western commitment. Countries considering alignment with the West would draw conclusions about American reliability. The psychological damage would extend far beyond Berlin. The message that abandonment would send was stark. If the United States would not sustain Berlin, would it sustain Paris? Would it sustain London? Would any commitment be reliable when tested? The stakes were far larger than a single city. What was being tested was the entire structure of Western security that was still being built. Another option was to challenge the blockade with military force. Armored columns could attempt to push through the blocked roads. The Soviets would then face a choice between allowing the convoys to pass or using force to stop them. But this option carried the risk of war. If shooting started on the roads to Berlin, escalation might prove impossible to control. The Western powers were not prepared for a ground war in Central Europe. The Soviet army was far larger than anything the West had available in Germany. The military balance in Europe heavily favored the Soviet Union in conventional forces. The rapid demobilization after the war had reduced American forces to a fraction of their wartime strength. The Europeans were still rebuilding. A ground war over Berlin would likely be a war the West would lose, unless it escalated to nuclear weapons, and escalation to nuclear weapons was a step no one wanted to take. A third option was emerging, though its feasibility was uncertain. West Berlin might be supplied by air. The agreements governing Berlin included provisions for air corridors connecting the city to the western zones. The Soviets had not closed these corridors. Aircraft could fly in and out of Berlin without crossing territory where the Soviets could block them legally. But the scale of the challenge was daunting. West Berlin had a population of more than 2 million people. The city required thousands of tons of supplies every day just to survive. Food, coal, medicine, and countless other necessities would all have to come by air. Nothing like this had ever been attempted. The largest air supply operations of the war had sustained far smaller populations for far shorter periods. The initial assessment of military planners was pessimistic. The calculations suggested that the available aircraft and airfields simply could not move enough cargo to keep the city alive. The tonnage required exceeded anything that seemed achievable with existing resources. Some advisors recommended abandoning Berlin rather than attempting an operation that seemed destined to fail. But other voices argued for trying. The political consequences of retreat were too severe to accept without attempting an alternative. Even if the airlift could not fully supply the city, it might buy time for diplomacy. It might demonstrate Western resolve even if it ultimately fell short. It might change the calculations on the Soviet side. There was also a moral dimension that weighed on decision-makers. The people of West Berlin had chosen to remain in the Western sectors. They had placed their trust in the Western powers. Abandoning them to Soviet control would be a betrayal that would haunt American credibility for years. It would mean telling 2 million people that the commitments made to them meant nothing when the cost of honoring those commitments became high. President Truman made the decision. The United States would not retreat from Berlin. The airlift would be attempted. If it failed, that failure would not be for lack of effort. The question was not whether they could, it was whether they would. What followed was an organizational achievement that became a defining example of American logistical capability. The airlift that sustained Berlin for nearly a year was not the result of a single brilliant plan. It was the result of continuous adaptation, relentless optimization, and the sustained effort of thousands of people doing their jobs with extraordinary dedication. The operation began modestly. In the first days after the blockade was imposed, a small number of transport aircraft began flying supplies into Berlin. The tonnage was far below what the city needed. The effort seemed almost symbolic, a gesture of defiance rather than a practical solution. But the operation grew. More aircraft were committed, procedures were refined, the rhythm of flights increased. What had begun as an improvised response became a systematic operation that improved week by week. The key to the airlift's success was the transformation of flying from individual missions into a continuous system. Each aircraft became a component in a larger machine. The goal was not to fly individual flights but to maintain a constant flow of cargo into the city. The organization required to sustain this flow was extraordinary. Planners had to coordinate aircraft from multiple bases. They had to schedule flights so that aircraft arrived at Berlin in a steady stream rather than in bunches that would overwhelm airfield capacity. They had to account for weather, maintenance, crew rest, and 1,000 other variables that could disrupt the carefully orchestrated schedule. Consider what happened when an aircraft landed at Tempelhof Airfield in the heart of West Berlin. The plane would touch down and taxi to the unloading area. Before the engines had fully stopped, ground crews were already moving toward it. The cargo doors would open. Teams of workers would begin unloading whatever the aircraft carried, whether sacks of flour, bags of coal, or crates of medicine. The unloading had to be fast. Every minute an aircraft sat on the ground was a minute it was not flying. The goal was to turn each plane around in under 30 minutes, unload the cargo, check the aircraft for obvious problems, refuel if necessary, get it back in the air. The ground crews worked in conditions that were often brutal. In winter, the cold was severe. The work was physical and exhausting. The pace was relentless. There was no time for careful consideration. There was only the next aircraft, and the next, and the next. Picture the scene at a Berlin airfield during the height of the operation. An aircraft has just landed. Before the propellers have stopped turning, trucks are already moving toward it. Workers in heavy coats climb onto the cargo bay. Bags of coal are passed hand to hand, loaded onto trucks, driven to distribution points across the city. Meanwhile, mechanics are checking the engines, the landing gear, the control surfaces. Fuel trucks are standing by. 30 minutes after landing, the aircraft is taxiing for takeoff. Another plane is already on approach behind it. Meanwhile, mechanics performed maintenance that would normally take place in well-equipped hangars. They worked on aircraft that were being pushed far beyond their normal operational limits. Engines that should have been overhauled kept flying. Airframes that should have been rested kept operating. The maintenance crews became masters of keeping worn equipment functional through skill and improvisation. The aircraft themselves were being worked harder than their designers had ever intended. Transport planes that were built for periodic use were flying continuously. Engines accumulated hours of operation in weeks that would normally accumulate over months. The stress on airframes, landing gear, and every mechanical component was intense. The maintenance crews developed techniques for keeping aircraft flying that went beyond the official manuals. They learned to recognize problems before they became failures. They became experts at repairs that kept planes operational when strict adherence to procedure would have grounded them. They took calculated risks because grounded aircraft could not deliver cargo. The air corridors into Berlin became among the busiest airways in the world. Aircraft took off and landed at intervals measured in minutes. The precision required was extraordinary. In bad weather, pilots flew on instruments alone, trusting the controllers who guided them through clouds and fog. The margin for error was small. The consequences of error were severe. Consider an approach in the depths of winter. A transport aircraft descending through thick clouds toward an airfield it cannot see. Ice forming on the wings despite the de-icing equipment. The pilot watching instruments that must be trusted absolutely because there is no visual reference outside the cockpit. Radio calls from controllers providing heading and altitude corrections. Other aircraft in the pattern, invisible but present, trusting the same controllers. The winter weather over Germany was often terrible for flying. Fog would settle over the airfields and not lift for days. Low clouds would obscure the approach paths. Ice would form on aircraft in ways that changed their flying characteristics. Snow would cover runways and reduce braking effectiveness. Every challenge that weather could pose, the airlift faced. The discipline required was absolute. Pilots could not deviate from assigned altitudes or headings. They could not slow down or speed up on their own initiative. The system worked only because everyone followed the procedures exactly. Individual judgment, which might be appropriate in other circumstances, could be fatal in the crowded corridors. The air traffic control system developed for the airlift was years ahead of civilian practice. Controllers tracked each aircraft through the corridor, maintaining separation that prevented collision while keeping the flow of traffic as dense as possible. The techniques developed during the airlift would influence air traffic control for decades afterward. Some pilots flew multiple missions per day. The exhaustion accumulated. The stress never diminished. They knew that a mistake could mean collision, could mean crashing into a city full of the people they were trying to save. And still they flew. The crews developed the kind of fatigue that goes beyond tiredness. They flew until flying became automatic, until the procedures were so ingrained that they could be executed without conscious thought. This was both necessary and dangerous. Necessary because the mission required more flights than well-rested crews could provide. Dangerous because fatigue degrades judgment in ways that are not always apparent to the person affected. It was not a flight, it was a system. And systems win crises. The volume of cargo delivered grew steadily as the operation matured. Procedures that had wasted time were streamlined. Bottlenecks that had limited throughput were identified and eliminated. The learning curve was steep, but the improvement was real. New aircraft were brought into the operation. The fleet was expanded and improved. Larger planes that could carry more cargo per flight were added. The capacity of the airlift increased week by week. The organization behind the flights became increasingly sophisticated. Planners calculated optimal cargo mixes. They determined how to balance the need for food against the need for fuel. They figured out how to load aircraft so that unloading would be fastest. Every inefficiency that could be eliminated was eliminated. The Berliners adapted to the reality of life under blockade. They became accustomed to rationing. They found ways to stretch the supplies that arrived. They developed the resilience that comes from having no alternative but to endure. The civilian population of West Berlin became participants in the operation rather than merely beneficiaries. They worked in the warehouses that received the cargo. They drove the trucks that distributed it. They maintained the infrastructure that the city needed to function. They conserved the resources that the airlift provided, knowing that waste meant shortage. The relationship between the city and the aircraft became something more than the practical matter of supply. The sound of engines overhead became reassurance. Children watched the planes and waved. Pilots, in gestures that became legendary, dropped candy attached to small parachutes for the children below. The operation acquired human dimensions that statistics could not capture. These small gestures of humanity amid the larger operation became symbols in their own right. The pilots who dropped candy were not ordered to do so. They did it because they could see the children watching, because they wanted to provide something beyond mere survival. The candy drops became famous around the world, humanizing the operation in ways that straightforward cargo delivery could not. Winter was the greatest test. The cold increased the demand for coal, which was heavy and consumed cargo capacity that might otherwise carry food. The weather made flying more difficult and more dangerous. Ice, fog, and low clouds created conditions that would have grounded operations in peacetime. The conditions pushed both aircraft and crews to their limits. But the operation continued. Through ice and fog, through mechanical failures and exhausted crews, the flights kept coming. The tonnage kept increasing. The city kept surviving. By the spring of 1949, the airlift was delivering cargo at a pace that made the blockade pointless. The operation that skeptics had said was impossible had become a demonstration of what determined people with adequate resources could achieve. The blockade was not working. West Berlin was not starving. The population was not surrendering. The Western powers were not retreating. Moscow faced a choice. The blockade could be maintained indefinitely, but it was failing to achieve its objectives while damaging Soviet reputation. Alternatively, the blockade could be lifted, which would constitute an admission of failure. Neither option was attractive, but continuing a failed policy indefinitely had costs that eventually outweighed the costs of acknowledging failure. In May 1949, nearly a year after it began, the blockade was lifted. Ground access to Berlin was restored. The airlift gradually wound down as normal supply routes resumed operation. The blockade was supposed to break the West. It ended up exposing Moscow. The question of why the Soviet Union did not simply shoot down the aircraft that were defeating the blockade is one that has occupied historians and strategists since the events occurred. The airlift was vulnerable. The aircraft were unarmed. The corridors were narrow. A few fighters could have turned the operation into a slaughter. But the Soviets did not attack. The reasons appear to have operated at multiple levels. At the military level, some accounts suggest that Soviet leaders feared where such an attack might lead. Shooting down American aircraft would be an act of war. The American response might not be limited to the air corridors. Escalation might prove impossible to control. The United States had nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union did not yet have a reliable arsenal. A war that began over Berlin might end with Soviet cities in flames. The risks of escalation were too high. The nuclear dimension was crucial. In 1948, the United States possessed atomic weapons and the means to deliver them. The Soviet Union had not yet tested its first atomic bomb. A conventional war in Europe would likely favor Soviet numbers. But a nuclear war would be catastrophic for the Soviet Union in ways that no conventional advantage could offset. This asymmetry constrained Soviet options. At the political level, an attack on unarmed aircraft delivering food and medicine would have carried enormous costs to Soviet reputation worldwide. The Soviet Union was trying to present itself as a defender of peace against Western aggression. Shooting down relief flights would contradict that narrative catastrophically. The global perception cost would have been severe. The blockade was supposed to look like a reasonable response to Western provocations. It was supposed to be deniable enough that the Soviet Union could maintain its position as a responsible power. Attack aircraft with fighters and all pretense would be stripped away. The Soviet Union would be revealed as the aggressor it claimed not to be. There was also a propaganda war being fought alongside the physical confrontation. The Soviet Union was competing for global opinion, particularly in countries that had not yet aligned with either bloc. An attack on relief aircraft would have been a propaganda disaster in precisely the audience Moscow most wanted to influence. Whatever the precise calculation, the result was that the airlift proceeded unmolested. The aircraft flew their missions, the cargo arrived, the city survived, and the Soviet Union found itself in the unexpected position of watching its pressure fail without any way to increase that pressure that would not carry unacceptable risks. The blockade had been designed to impose costs on the West while avoiding the costs of war. But the airlift imposed costs on the Soviet Union while avoiding the costs of war. The Western response had found a way to resist without triggering the escalation that Moscow was counting on the West to fear. The imagery of the airlift was powerful. Aircraft bringing food to a besieged city. Pilots risking their lives to sustain civilians. A population enduring hardship with dignity. The contrast with the image of the blockade was stark. One side was building. The other side was starving. This imagery reached audiences around the world. The Berlin Airlift became a symbol of Western resolve and Western values. It demonstrated that the commitment to defend allies was real. It showed that American resources and American organizational capacity could be deployed for constructive purposes. It provided a counter-narrative to Soviet propaganda about Western imperialism. When a siege becomes a symbol of the besieger's failure, the strategic calculation has been reversed. The lifting of the blockade in May 1949 was not the end of tensions over Berlin. The city would remain a flashpoint throughout the Cold War. Crises would recur. Walls would eventually be built. The division of the city would become a permanent feature of the European landscape for decades. But the blockade had established something important. It had demonstrated that the Western commitment to Berlin was real. It had shown that Soviet pressure, even extreme pressure, would not automatically produce Western retreat. It had proven that creativity and determination could find responses to challenges that seemed insurmountable. The experience of the blockade also revealed the need for something more systematic than improvisation. The airlift had succeeded, but it had been a near thing. The margins had been narrow. The effort had required resources that could not be sustained indefinitely. A crisis of similar magnitude might not turn out the same way. The Western powers had defended Berlin successfully, but the defense had been improvised in response to an emergency. There had been no guarantee that the resources would be available. There had been no formal commitment that obligated allies to support each other. There had been no structure that could coordinate a response before the crisis occurred rather than after. The lesson was clear. The West needed arrangements that would deter Soviet pressure in the first place rather than responding to it after the fact. The West needed commitments that were visible and binding. so that potential adversaries would know in advance what resistance they would face. The experience of Berlin also demonstrated the importance of alliance. The airlift had been primarily an American operation, but it could not have succeeded without British participation and French cooperation. The Western powers had worked together effectively, but they had done so without formal structures that guaranteed cooperation. The next crisis might not find them so well aligned. When a test almost becomes a disaster, the next step is to create permanent rules. The Berlin Airlift lasted for nearly a year. It delivered millions of tons of cargo. It kept more than 2 million people alive through a winter of scarcity. It demonstrated capabilities that the Soviet Union had not believed the West possessed. But its significance extended beyond the immediate achievement of sustaining the city. The airlift changed how the Western powers thought about their relationship with each other and their relationship with the Soviet threat. The experience revealed the importance of coordination and mutual support. No single country could have sustained the airlift alone. British aircraft flew alongside American aircraft. British and American ground crews worked together. French airfields provided additional capacity. The operation was a coalition effort, and its success depended on that coalition character. This lesson reinforced the emerging conviction that the Western response to Soviet pressure needed to be institutionalized. Ad hoc cooperation had worked in Berlin, but relying on ad hoc cooperation for every future crisis was a recipe for failure. There needed to be structures in place before crises occurred. There needed to be commitments that were clear and binding. There needed to be mechanisms for coordinating responses quickly and effectively. The Berlin experience also demonstrated the psychological importance of visible commitment. The Soviet Union had calculated that the West would not sustain the effort required to supply Berlin by air. That calculation was wrong. But it was wrong in part because the Western powers made a visible commitment that they then felt obligated to honor. The decision to attempt the airlift created its own momentum. Having committed, retreat became psychologically and politically more difficult. A formal alliance structure could create similar dynamics. Commitments made in advance, publicly, and with binding force would be harder to abandon than commitments made in response to immediate pressure. Potential adversaries would know in advance what resistance they would face. The deterrent effect of commitment would be stronger if the commitment was visible and credible before any crisis began. The Berlin blockade had been a test. The West had passed the test. But the experience made clear that passing tests one at a time was not a sustainable strategy. The tests would keep coming. The resources required to pass them could not be mobilized from scratch each time. The relationships required for effective cooperation could not be built under the pressure of crisis. The solution was an alliance. A permanent structure that would institutionalize the cooperation that had developed through necessity. A commitment that would be visible to adversaries and allies alike. A shield that would deter aggression rather than simply responding to it. The discussions that would produce such an alliance were already underway as the blockade continued. The experience of Berlin accelerated and focused those discussions. The need for a collective security arrangement became more urgent with each week that the airlift continued. The airlift had proven that the West could respond to Soviet pressure. But responding to pressure crisis by crisis was exhausting and uncertain. What was needed was a structure that would prevent crises from arising in the first place by making clear that aggression would be met with collective resistance. The Berlin experience also shaped how that alliance would be conceived. It would not be merely a military arrangement, it would be an expression of shared values. The airlift had demonstrated that the West was willing to expend enormous resources to protect people who chose not to live under communist rule. The alliance would embody that commitment in permanent form. The airlift kept Berlin alive, but it proved a deeper point. The West needed a shield that did not depend on improvisation in every crisis. In 1949, that shield got a name: NATO.